The heart monitor flatlined as I lay unconscious in the trauma bay, my body broken from the car accident that should have killed me. But what nearly destroyed me wasn't the shattered ribs or the internal bleeding. It was watching through barely open eyes as Ryan, the man I'd loved for 3 years, looked at my mangled body and walked away. He told the nurse he'd never seen me before in his life. 6 years later, I stood in my pristine white coat as the head of trauma surgery at Mercy General Hospital, holding his medical chart in my hands. Ryan Mitchell was dying, and I was the only surgeon skilled enough to save him. But the question wasn't whether I could save his life. It was whether I would choose to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Parker, and at 22, I thought I had everything figured out. The morning of October 15th started like any other Saturday in Portland, with the familiar sound of rain pattering against the windows of my tiny studio apartment in southeast Portland. I was curled up on my secondhand couch, wearing Ryan's oversized University of Oregon sweatshirt, with anatomy textbooks scattered around me like a paper fortress. The smell of coffee mixed with the vanilla candle Ryan had bought me last week, creating the kind of cozy atmosphere that made me believe in forever. I was a pre-med student at Oregon Health and Science University, 3 years into what felt like the hardest academic program known to humanity. Every morning, I woke up at 5 to review flashcards, before my 6-hour shift at the campus bookstore, then attended classes until evening, only to come home and study until my eyes burned. Most people thought I was crazy for putting myself through such a grueling schedule, but I had a dream that burned brighter than my exhaustion. I was going to become a surgeon. Growing up as the daughter of Miguel and Rosa Parker, who owned Parker's Diner on Division Street, I'd learned early that nothing in life came easy. My parents had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but determination and the secret to my grandmother's salsa recipe. They worked 18-hour days to keep the diner running, serving coffee and comfort food to construction workers and college students alike. Every penny they earned went toward keeping me in school, and I wasn't about to let their sacrifice be in vain. The morning light filtering through my apartment windows illuminated the acceptance letter from OHSU's medical school that I'd pinned to my bulletin board 6 months ago. Getting in had been the culmination of 4 years of perfect grades, volunteer work at free clinics, and countless nights spent studying while other students partied. But the real celebration had been Ryan's reaction when I'd called him with the news. He'd driven straight to my apartment, swept me up in his arms, and spun me around until we were both dizzy and laughing. Ryan Mitchell had been my boyfriend for 3 years, ever since we'd met in an organic chemistry study group during my sophomore year. He was everything I wasn't: confident where I was anxious, wealthy where I was struggling, popular where I was studious. With his sandy brown hair that always looked perfectly tousled and his easy smile that could charm professors into extending deadlines, Ryan moved through the world like someone who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with charm or his father's money. His family owned Mitchell Construction, one of Portland's most successful building companies, and they lived in a sprawling house in the Cedar Hills area that was worth more than my parents would make in a lifetime. The first time Ryan had brought me home for dinner, I'd felt like an imposter sitting at their mahogany dining table, trying to remember which fork to use while his mother, Patricia, asked pointed questions about my background. But Ryan had squeezed my hand under the table and later told me he loved how real I was compared to the artificial people in his usual social circle. That Saturday morning, as I highlighted passages in my pathophysiology textbook, my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Big party tonight at the Sigma Key House. You're coming with me. No excuses." I smiled at the screen, knowing he was trying to drag me away from my books again. Ryan was always trying to get me to relax, to enjoy college life instead of treating it like a military operation. He didn't understand that for me, every grade mattered, every opportunity was precious, because I was one mistake away from losing everything I'd worked for. I texted back, "Can't. Midterms next week and I'm behind on my immunology note." The response came immediately, "Jess, you're already the smartest person I know. One night won't kill you. Plus, I have something special planned." There was something about that last line that made my stomach flutter with anticipation. Ryan had been acting mysterious all week, mentioning surprise plans and giving me secretive smiles when he thought I wasn't looking. The truth was, despite my protests about studying, I was desperately in love with Ryan Mitchell. He represented everything I'd never had: security, confidence, a future that didn't involve scraping together grocery money or wearing the same pair of jeans until they fell apart. When I was with him, I felt like I belonged somewhere bigger than my small world of textbooks and student loans. He made me feel beautiful when I caught him staring at me across the library, and important when he introduced me to his fraternity brothers as my brilliant girlfriend who's going to be a surgeon. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself trying on different outfits in front of my small mirror, settling on dark jeans and the emerald green top that Ryan said brought out my eyes. I spent extra time on my makeup, something I rarely bothered with during the week, and straightened my usually wavy dark hair until it fell smoothly past my shoulder. When Ryan picked me up in his silver BMW, a graduation gift from his parents, I felt like I was stepping into a different version of my life, one where I wasn't constantly worried about money or grades, or living up to everyone's expectations. The Sigma Key house was already pulsing with music when we arrived, the kind of massive party that would probably result in noise complaints and cleanup costs that exceeded my monthly rent. Ryan's hand found mine as we walked through the crowd, and I felt the familiar mix of pride and intimidation that came with being his girlfriend at these events. Everyone knew Ryan. He was the guy who could get you into exclusive parties, who had connections through his family's business, who would probably be running the city's social scene in 10 years. But that night, he only had eyes for me. He kept me close, his arm around my waist as he talked to friends, including me in conversations about business internships and post-graduation plans that I usually felt excluded from. When someone mentioned the medical school acceptance letter I'd received, Ryan's chest puffed out with pride as he bragged about dating the future Dr. Jessica Parker. In those moments, surrounded by his world but clearly claimed as his, I felt like the luckiest girl alive. The party blurred together in a haze of loud music, red plastic cups, and the kind of carefree energy that comes with being young and believing the future is limitless. Ryan introduced me to friends I'd never met, told stories about our relationship that made me sound more glamorous than I felt, and kept his hand on me in a way that felt possessive but loving. When a group of his fraternity brothers started talking about their spring break plans in Cabo, Ryan squeezed my shoulder and said, "Jess and I are thinking about Europe this summer, Paris, maybe Rome." It was the first I'd heard of these plans, but the way he said it, like our future was already written, made my heart race with possibility. As the night progressed, I noticed Ryan drinking more than usual, his cheeks flushed and his laughter a little too loud, but he seemed happy, relaxed in a way I rarely saw when he was stressed about classes or dealing with pressure from his father about joining the family business. When he pulled me aside around 11 o'clock, his eyes bright with alcohol and excitement, I thought he was going to suggest we head home. Instead, he took my hands in his and said, "Jess, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about us, about our future, and I want you to know that you're the most important thing in my life." My heart stopped as he reached into his jacket pocket, and for one wild moment, I thought he was going to propose. We were only 22, still in college, but the way he was looking at me made anything seem possible. What he pulled out wasn't a ring but a small wrapped box that contained a delicate silver necklace with a heart pendant. "I wanted you to have this," he said, his words slightly slurred but his expression earnest. "It's a promise that no matter what happens after graduation, no matter where our careers take us, we're going to figure this out together." As he fastened the necklace around my neck, his fingers gentle against my skin, I felt tears prick my eyes. This was it. This was the moment I'd know I wasn't just his college girlfriend, but the woman he wanted to build a life with. The party continued around us, but for those few minutes, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Ryan held me close as we swayed to a slow song that barely cut through the noise, and I pressed my face against his chest, breathing in his familiar cologne mixed with the scent of his cotton shirt. "I love you, Jessica Parker," he whispered into my hair. "I love your ambition, your kindness, the way you make me want to be better than I am." I tilted my face up to look at him, seeing my future reflected in his blue eyes, and whispered back, "I love you too, Ryan Mitchell, more than I ever thought possible. Looking back now, I realize that was the last moment of pure happiness I would have for a very long time, because when midnight approached and Ryan suggested we head back to his apartment, I had no idea that the decision to get in his car would change everything. I had no way of knowing that in less than an hour I would be fighting for my life, while the man I loved pretended he'd never seen me before. As we walked out of that party, Ryan's arm around my shoulders and the promise necklace warm against my throat, I was still the girl who believed in forever, who thought love was enough to overcome any obstacle. I was about to learn how wrong I could. The drive back to Ryan's apartment should have taken 15 minutes. I remember settling into the passenger seat of his BMW, the leather still holding the warmth from earlier in the evening, and adjusting the heart necklace that felt like a talisman against my chest. The Portland streets were slick with the day's rain, reflecting the glow of streetlights and wavering pools of gold and amber. Ryan had turned on some soft music, and I was leaning back against the headrest, feeling drowsy and content in the way that comes after a perfect evening. I should have noticed that Ryan was driving faster than usual, taking turns a little too sharply, but I was lost in the dreamy haze of being 22 and in love. We were talking about our plans for the next day, something mundane about studying together at the library, when I saw Ryan fumble for his phone as it buzzed on the dashboard. The device had been going off intermittently all evening, but he'd been ignoring it in favor of giving me his full attention. "Ryan, don't," I said, reaching over to touch his arm. "Just let it ring." But he was already glancing down at the screen, his face illuminated by the blue glow. In that split second, his attention completely diverted from the road. I saw the intersection approaching too fast. I saw the red light we were about to run. I saw the delivery truck coming from our right, its headlights growing larger by the second. "Ryan!" I screamed, but it was too late. The impact came from my side of the car, a sound like the world exploding that I felt in my bones before I heard it. The BMW spun, metal shrieking against metal, glass exploding inward like deadly rain. Time became strange and elastic, stretching out so I could feel every rotation, every piece of debris that cut through the air. The heart necklace Ryan had given me just hours before, pressed against my throat as my body was thrown against.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The door, then forward into the dashboard, then back again in a violent dance I had no control over. When the spinning finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the crash itself. It was broken only by the hiss of steam from the destroyed engine, and the tinkling sound of glass still falling from the shattered windows. I tried to call Ryan's name, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. Every breath felt like broken glass in my chest, and when I tried to move, waves of agony shot through my entire body. From the corner of my vision, I could see Ryan in the driver's seat. He was conscious, moving, pushing himself up from where he'd been thrown forward. There was blood on his forehead from where he'd hit the steering wheel, and his shirt was torn, but he was talking, responding to the voices that were beginning to gather outside the wreckage. Relief flooded through me even through my pain. He was alive. We were both alive. Everything else could be fixed. "Ryan," I managed to whisper, reaching toward him with fingers that didn't seem to work properly. "Ryan, I can't. Something's wrong. I can't feel my legs." He turned toward me then, and what I saw in his face wasn't concern or love or even fear. It was calculation. His blue eyes, which had looked at me with such tenderness just an hour before, were now assessing me like I was a problem to be solved. The change was so stark, so immediate, that for a moment I thought I was hallucinating from head trauma. "Ryan," I said again more urgently now, because something in his expression was terrifying me more than the physical pain. "Help me, please." Instead of reaching for me, instead of calling my name or asking if I was okay, Ryan looked around frantically. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer, and the voices outside were getting louder as more people arrived at the scene. Someone was shouting about calling 911, about checking if anyone was hurt, about getting the doors open. And that's when Ryan did something that shattered my heart more completely than the accident had shattered my body. He looked directly at me, this man who had just promised to love me forever, who had fastened a necklace around my throat as a symbol of our future together, and his face went completely blank. Not angry, not panicked, not even guilty, just empty, like he was looking at a strange. "Ryan," I pleaded, tasting blood in my mouth now, feeling something warm running down my face. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave." But he was already moving, unfastening his seatbelt with shaking hands, pushing against his door that was only slightly dented compared to the catastrophic damage on my side. As the first responders reached the car, as hands began working to get us out, I heard Ryan's voice talking to them, clear, coherent, and devastating in its calmness. "I don't know who she is," he said, his voice carrying through the broken window. "I was driving alone. She must have been in another car." The words hit me harder than the truck. I tried to speak, to contradict him, to scream that he was lying, but all that came out was a choking sound as fluid filled my throat. The paramedics were working frantically now, one of them talking into a radio about multiple injuries, possible internal bleeding, the need for immediate transport. Through the chaos of voices and sirens and the mechanical sounds of extraction equipment, I kept hearing Ryan repeat his lie. "I've never seen her before. I was alone in my car. I don't know how she got here." Each repetition was like another blow, another betrayal that cut deeper than any physical injury. As they worked to extract me from the wreckage, my consciousness fading in and out like a weak radio signal, I caught glimpses of Ryan being checked over by the EMT. Someone had given him a blanket, and he was sitting on the back of an ambulance, answering questions with the practiced ease of someone who had never been more sure of anything in his life. When one of the officers gestured toward where they were pulling me from the car, Ryan didn't even look in my direction. The last thing I saw before they loaded me into the ambulance was Ryan walking away. Not to another ambulance, not to the hospital, but to a car that had pulled up at the edge of the scene, his father's black Mercedes. He climbed into the passenger seat without looking back, without asking about my condition, without acknowledging that just hours before he had told me I was the most important thing in his life. As the ambulance doors closed and we raced toward Mercy General Hospital, the paramedics working frantically to keep me stable, I understood that Ryan hadn't just abandoned me at the scene of an accident. He had made a calculated decision to erase me from his life entirely, to protect himself and his reputation, at the cost of everything we had built together. The heart necklace was still around my throat, but it felt like a noose now, a reminder of how quickly love could turn to betrayal. I died twice on the way to the hospital, my heart stopping as internal bleeding overwhelmed my system. Each time, the paramedics fought to bring me back, their voices urgent, as they called out blood pressure readings and drug dosage. Each time I slipped away, I thought about Ryan's blank expression, the ease with which he had denied knowing me, the way he had walked away without looking back. But I came back. Both times I came back, because even as my body was shutting down, even as my heart literally stopped beating, there was something inside me that refused to die in the back of that ambulance. Something that refused to let Ryan's betrayal be the end of my story. Chapter 3, The Ultimatum That Never Came. The trauma bay at Mercy General Hospital was a symphony of controlled chaos when they wheeled me. Bright lights that cut through my damaged vision like knives, voices calling out medical terminology that my pre-med brain recognized even as my body fought for survival. Through the haze of pain and medication, I caught fragments of what the doctors were saying: collapsed lung, internal bleeding, possible spinal injury, traumatic brain injury. Each diagnosis felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I had been living just hours before. Dr. Sarah Chen was the trauma surgeon on call that night, a woman whose reputation at Mercy General was legendary among the medical students who rotated through the hospital. She was known for her precision, her calm under pressure, and her unwillingness to give up on patients that other doctors might have written off. As she worked over me, her voice steady as she called out instructions to her team, I found myself clinging to that voice like a lifeline. "Talk to me about the accident," Dr. Chen said to one of the nurses as they prepped me for emergency surgery. "Any witnesses, family members we need to contact?" "Single vehicle collision," the nurse replied, reading from the chart. "Driver claims he doesn't know the patient, says he was alone in the car, No ID on the victim, even through the fog of pain medication. Those words cut deep. Ryan wasn't going to claim me, wasn't going to identify me, wasn't going to explain to these doctors that I had insurance through the university, that my parents needed to be called, that I had a life and people who loved me. I was going to be treated as a Jane Doe, because the man who had promised to love me forever had decided I was worth less than his reputation. I tried to speak, to tell them who I was, to give them my parents' number so someone could call Parker's Diner and explain why their daughter wasn't coming home. But the breathing tube they had inserted made speech impossible, and the injuries to my chest meant that even the effort of trying to communicate sent spikes of agony through my entire body. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I caught a glimpse of the waiting area through the automatic doors. For one desperate moment, I thought I saw a familiar figure, thought maybe Ryan had come to check on me, to reclaim me, to explain that his denial had been some kind of shock-induced confusion. But when I focused my blurred vision, trying to make out faces in the harsh fluorescent lighting, there was no one there who looked like him. The surgery took 8 hours. I learned this later, along with the details of what Dr. Chen and her team had accomplished in that operating room. They had repaired a lacerated spleen, reinflated a collapsed lung, stopped internal bleeding that had nearly killed me twice, and stabilized a spinal injury that could have left me paralyzed. It was the kind of surgery that medical students read about in textbooks, the kind that separated truly gifted surgeons from merely competent ones. When I woke up 3 days later, the first thing I saw was my mother's face. Rosa Parker looked like she had aged a decade since I had seen her last, her usually neat black hair falling in tired wisps around her face, her dark eyes red-rimmed from crying. She was holding my hand with both of hers, and when she saw my eyes open, she started sobbing with a mixture of relief and anguish that broke my heart. "Mija," she whispered, using the endearment she had called me since childhood. "Oh, my baby girl, we thought we had lost you." My father stood behind her, his usually strong frame diminished by worry and exhaustion. Miguel Parker was a man who had worked construction before opening the diner, whose hands were permanently stained with years of honest labor, who had never met a problem he couldn't solve through hard work and determination. But seeing his daughter broken and intubated in a hospital bed had brought him to his knees in a way that poverty and struggle never had. "How?" I managed to croak through a throat that felt like sandpaper. "How did you find me?" The story they told me was worse than I could have imagined. For 3 days I had been listed as Jane Doe in the hospital system. No one had claimed me. No one had identified me. No one had authorized the expensive surgeries that had saved my life. It was only when my roommate Lisa noticed I hadn't come home and started calling hospitals that my identity was finally established. Lisa had to bring my parents down from the diner, had to identify me herself because my face was so swollen and bruised that even people who loved me needed time to recognize me. "Where is Ryan?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Has he been here? Has he called?" The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that comes from 30 years of marriage and partnership. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice careful and measured in the way it got when she was trying to protect me from painful truth. "Mija, the police said the driver of the car claimed he was alone. He said he didn't know who you were." "But that's impossible," I said, my voice getting stronger with indignation. "I was his girlfriend. We were together for 3 years. We were at the party together. We left together." I tried to sit up, but the pain in my chest and back forced me back down onto the pillows. "There has to be some mistake. Maybe he has a head injury. Maybe he's confused." My father stepped forward then, his weathered hands gripping the bed rail, so tightly his knuckles went white. "Jessica, we tried to contact him. Lisa gave us his information, told us about the relationship. We called his family's house, and," his mother answered, "she said she had never heard of you. She said Ryan had been at home all evening, that he had never been to any party." Miguel's voice was tight with controlled anger. "She hung up when we tried to explain about the accident. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment I couldn't process it. Ryan hadn't just denied knowing me in the immediate aftermath of the accident. He had gone home, told his family a story that erased me entirely,
and was maintaining that lie even as I lay fighting for my life in a hospital bed. The heart necklace was gone, cut away by the trauma team along with my clothes, but I could still feel its phantom weight against my throat. The insurance, I said suddenly, panic rising in my chest, the surgeries, the hospital stay. How are we going to pay for this? My parents' silence was answer enough. The costs of my care were astronomical, the kind of medical bills that could destroy a family like ours. My parents had already spoken to the financial counselors, had already started the process of trying to figure out how to cover expenses that exceeded their annual income from the diner by 10 times over. Over the following days, as I lay in that hospital bed, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered life, I learned the full extent of what Ryan's abandonment meant. Without a responsible party to authorize treatment, without insurance information, without family to advocate for me, I had received excellent emergency care but was now facing a financial catastrophe that would follow me for the rest of my life. The police investigation had concluded that Ryan was telling the truth about being alone in the car. There were no witnesses who had seen us leave the party together, no evidence that contradicted his story. The accident was ruled a single vehicle collision caused by driver error, and Ryan received a citation for reckless driving. No criminal charges, no acknowledgement that there had been a passenger, no investigation into how I had supposedly appeared in his car. Lisa brought me my belongings from the apartment we shared, including textbooks that were now stained with my blood from the night of the accident. She also brought news from campus that felt like salt in my wound. Ryan was back in classes, attending parties, living his life as if nothing had happened. When Lisa had tried to approach him at the library, to demand answers about what had really happened that night, he had looked at her with genuine confusion and claimed he had no idea who she was talking about. "It's like you never existed to him," Lisa said, her voice filled with the kind of anger that comes from watching someone you love be destroyed by someone else's cruelty. Like 3 years of your life together was just wiped away. But the cruelest cut came when Jane made her rounds one morning, about a week after I had regained consciousness. She sat down beside my bed, her expression serious but kind, and explained that my injuries were more severe than they had initially appeared. The spinal damage, while not causing paralysis, would require months of physical therapy. The traumatic brain injury meant I would have to relearn some basic cognitive function. Most devastating of all, the combination of injuries and the stress they had placed on my body meant that my dreams of medical school would have to be put on hold indefinitely. "I'm not saying never," Dr. Chen said gently, "but Jessica, you're looking at a year, maybe 2 of rehabilitation before you're functioning at your previous level. The medical school will hold your spot, but you'll need to defer enrollment." As I listened to her words, feeling the weight of another dream slipping away, I realized that Ryan's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, academic, financial, and emotional. By denying me, by refusing to take responsibility for the accident that had destroyed my body, he had also destroyed my timeline, my plans, my carefully constructed path toward becoming the surgeon I had always dreamed of being. That night, alone in my hospital room, with machines beeping around me, and pain medication making everything feel distant and surreal, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life.
I wasn't going to let Ryan Mitchell's betrayal be the end of my story. I was going to heal, I was going to fight, and I was going to become the doctor I had always planned to be. But more than that, I was going to make sure that someday, somehow, Ryan would face the consequences of what he had done to me. I didn't know then that it would take 6 years. I didn't know that the path back to medicine would be longer and harder than anything I had ever imagined. I didn't know that by the time I saw Ryan again, I would be the one holding his life in my hands. But lying there in that hospital bed, abandoned and broken but not defeated, I made a promise to myself that I would keep no matter how long it took. Ryan Mitchell had left me for dead, but I was very much alive. And I was going to make sure he never forgot it. Chapter 4. The stand I never got to make. The rehabilitation center, where I spent the next 4 months, was a stark institutional building on the outskirts of Portland that smelled perpetually of disinfectant and defeat. Sunrise Recovery Center, specialized in patients with traumatic injuries, the kind of place where people went to relearn how to walk, how to speak, how to perform the basic functions of daily life that most people took for granted. I was 22 years old, and I was learning how to hold a pen again. The brain injury had affected my fine motor skills and my short-term memory in ways that were both subtle and devastating. I could remember every detail of my childhood, every conversation I'd had with Ryan before the accident, every anatomical structure I'd memorized for my pre-med classes. But I couldn't remember what I'd had for breakfast or write my name without my hand shaking like an old woman. The doctors assured me this was temporary, that with time and therapy I would regain full function. But temporary felt like forever when you were living it one frustrating day at a time. My physical therapist was a woman named Patricia Reeves, a former Army medic who approached rehabilitation with the intensity of a military campaign. She was in her 50s, built like someone who could bench press twice her body weight, and had absolutely no patience for self-pity or excuses. Under her relentless supervision, I spent hours every day working to rebuild the strength and coordination that the accident had stolen from me. "Your boyfriend didn't just abandon you," Patricia said one afternoon as I struggled through a set of exercises designed to improve my hand-eye coordination. "He abandoned the woman you were, but that means you get to decide who you're going to become next." The comment stung because it was true. The Jessica who had been in that car with Ryan, who had trusted him completely, who had believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle, was gone. In her place was someone harder, more cynical, but also more determined. Every day that I spent in rehabilitation, every small victory in regaining my physical and cognitive abilities, was proof that I was stronger than Ryan had given me credit for. My parents visited every day, bringing homemade food that violated hospital nutrition guidelines and updates about the diner that kept me connected to the world outside the sterile walls of the recovery center. My father had taken a second job doing night security to help with the medical bills, and my mother was working double shifts, but they never complained, never made me feel like my recovery was a burden they couldn't bear. "Misha," my mother said one evening as she helped me with the occupational therapy homework that was designed to rebuild my cognitive function, "Dr. Chen called today. She wants to know if you're still interested in that research position she mentioned." Chen had been visiting me regularly throughout my rehabilitation, not as my doctor but as a mentor who had seen something in me worth nurturing. She had offered me a position as a research assistant in her trauma surgery laboratory, work that I could do part-time while I continued my recovery, and eventually prepared to reapply to medical school. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted, staring at the occupational therapy worksheets that still felt impossibly difficult even after months of practice. "What if I can't keep up? What if my brain isn't the same as it was before?" "Then you'll work twice as hard as everyone else," my mother said with the matter-of-fact determination that had carried her through 30 years of marriage to my father and building a business from nothing. "That's what we do, Misha. We work harder than everyone else, because we have to." The research position turned out to be exactly what I needed. Working in Dr. Chen's laboratory, analyzing data on trauma outcomes and surgical techniques, gave me a sense of purpose that pure rehabilitation had been missing. The work was challenging enough to push my recovering cognitive abilities, but not so overwhelming that I felt defeated by my limitations. More importantly, it kept me connected to medicine, to the dream that had sustained me through the darkest days of my recovery. It was during this time that I learned the full extent of Ryan's betrayal through sources I hadn't expected. Lisa, my former roommate, had become friends with someone who worked in the financial aid office at the university. Through this connection, I discovered that Ryan had not only denied knowing me to the police and the hospital, but had also filed paperwork with the university claiming that we had never been in a relationship. The detail that cut deepest was that Ryan had specifically requested that any record of our dating be removed from university social media accounts and event photos. He had gone through 3 years of digital history and systematically erased any evidence that Jessica Parker had ever been part of his life. Photos from formals, study group pictures, casual shots from campus events, all of them had been edited or deleted at Ryan's request. "It's like he planned this," Lisa said when she brought me printouts of the email communications she had obtained through her friend, "like he knew exactly how to make you disappear from his life completely." Reading those emails, Seeing the cold, bureaucratic language Ryan had used to erase our relationship was worse than the physical pain of my injuries. This wasn't a moment of panic at an accident scene or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, methodical decision to destroy any evidence that he had ever cared about me, but the discovery also crystallized something inside me that had been building throughout my rehabilitation. I wasn't going to let Ryan's betrayal define the rest of my life. I was going to use it as fuel for something bigger, something that would prove that abandoning me had been the biggest mistake he would ever make. I threw myself into my recovery with an intensity that worried my physical therapists and impressed my doctor. Every exercise, every cognitive drill, every small step toward regaining my previous abilities became part of a larger mission. I wasn't just healing from a traumatic brain injury, I was rebuilding myself into someone stronger, smarter, and more determined than the woman who had trusted Ryan Mitchell with her heart and her future. The work in Dr. Chian's laboratory expanded my understanding of trauma surgery in ways that classroom learning never could have. I saw the data behind life and death decisions, understood the split-second judgments that determined whether patients lived or died, learned about the cutting-edge techniques that were revolutionizing emergency medicine. More importantly, I began to understand what separated great surgeons from merely competent ones, and I started building the knowledge base that would eventually make me one of the best. 8 months after the accident, I took the MCAT again. My first score had been good enough to get me into medical school the first time, but I knew I needed to do better if I wanted to rebuild my academic momentum after the gap in my education. I studied with the same obsessive intensity that had characterized my pre-med years, but now that intensity was driven by something deeper than academic ambition. It was driven by the knowledge that every point I scored, every question I answered correctly, was proof that Ryan had underestimated me. When my scores came back, they were 97th percentile, higher than they had been before the accident, higher than they needed to be for any medical school in the country. Dr. Chen framed the score report and hung it in her office, next to the awards and recognitions she had earned over decades of surgical excellence. "You're not the same person who was in that car," she said when she saw my reaction to the scores. "You're someone better, someone who understands what it means to fight for your life in ways that most people never will." The medical school application process the second time around was different from my original experience. This time I wasn't just a promising pre-med student with good grades and volunteer experience. I was a survivor who had overcome traumatic brain injury to achieve academic excellence. Someone who understood patient care from both sides of the doctor-patient relationship. My personal statement wrote itself, a story of resilience and determination that admissions committees found compelling. But more than that, I had clarity about my goals that I hadn't possessed before the accident. I wasn't going to be just any kind of doctor. I was going to specialize in trauma surgery, was going to become the kind of physician who could save lives in the most desperate circumstance. I was going to become someone who could stand over a broken body in an emergency room and make the split-second decisions that determined whether that person lived or died. When the acceptance letters started arriving, I had options I hadn't dared to dream about before. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, all of them wanted Jessica Parker, but the choice was easy. I was going to stay at Oregon Health and Science University, was going to train under Dr. Chen and the trauma surgery team that had saved my life. I was going to become the best version of myself in the same city where Ryan Mitchell thought he had destroyed me. The night before I started medical school, I sat in my parents' small apartment above the diner, looking out at the Portland skyline through windows that had been my view for most of my childhood. The city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere out there Ryan was living his life, probably unaware that the woman he had abandoned was about to begin the journey that would eventually bring his choices full circle. I touched the scar on my collarbone where the heart necklace had been cut away by the trauma team, a thin white line that was the only visible reminder of the accident that had changed everything. Ryan had given me that necklace as a promise of forever, but the scar it left behind was a better symbol of what forever actually meant. It meant survival, determination, and the absolute certainty that justice, even if it took years to arrive, was worth waiting for. Medical school was going to be 4 years. Residency would be another 5. Fellowship training in trauma surgery would add 2 more years on top of that. 11 years total before I would be a fully trained trauma surgeon, before I would have the skills and authority to save lives in the most critical situations. I didn't know then that it would take exactly 6 years for Ryan and I to meet again. I didn't know that when we did, he would be the one fighting for his life while I held his fate in my hands. But as I sat in that apartment, looking out at the city where my future was waiting, I made a promise to myself that I would keep no matter how long it took. Ryan Mitchell had left me for dead, but I was very much alive, and someday he was going to remember exactly who Jessica Parker was. Chapter 5: The Abandonment That Forged Me. Medical school at Oregon Health and Science University was like being thrown into a tornado of information, competition, and exhaustion that never stopped spinning. The first year was a relentless assault of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and pathology, with exams that could make or break careers before they even started. But I attacked every class, every lab, every study session with the intensity of someone who understood that this opportunity was precious, because it had almost been taken away from me. My classmates were brilliant, driven, competitive in the way that medical students had to be to survive the program. Most of them were fresh from undergraduate programs, 22 and 23 years old, with the kind of confidence that came from never having their lives completely destroyed and rebuilt. I was 24 now, only 2 years older, but the gap felt enormous. While they worried about grades and clinical rotations and matching into their preferred residencies, I carried the weight of knowing exactly how fragile life could be. Jane had secured me a work-study position in the trauma surgery department, which meant I spent my free time between classes observing surgeries, reviewing case studies, and learning the rhythm of emergency medicine. The other students thought I was crazy for taking on extra work during the most demanding academic program any of us had ever experienced, but the trauma bay felt like home in a way that lecture halls never could. It was during my second year that I first heard Ryan's name mentioned in a context that had nothing to do with my past. I was reviewing patient charts in the trauma department when one of the attending physicians mentioned a major donation that Mitchell Construction had made to fund a new wing of the hospital. The Mitchell family, it turned out, had become significant philanthropists in Portland's medical community, their name appearing on buildings and research centers throughout the city. "The Mitchells are good people," Rodriguez, one of the emergency medicine attendings, said as he updated me on a case we were following. "David Mitchell has done more for healthcare infrastructure in this city than any other private citizen. His son Ryan is being groomed to take over the foundation work when David retired." I managed to keep my expression neutral as I absorbed this information, but inside my stomach was churning with a mixture of rage and irony that was almost overwhelming. The Mitchell family was being celebrated for their contributions to emergency medicine, the very field that had saved my life after their son had left me to die. Ryan was being praised as a future philanthropist, while I carried medical debt that would take decades to repay because of his abandonment. But the information also gave me something I hadn't had before: insight into Ryan's current life. Through careful research that I told myself was just curiosity, I learned that Ryan had graduated from business school and was now working in his father's construction company while also managing the family foundation. He was engaged to someone named Amanda Richardson, a lawyer from another prominent Portland family, and they were planning a wedding that would be covered in the society pages of the local newspaper. Looking at photos of Ryan and Amanda at charity galas and foundation events, I was struck by how little he had changed. He still had the same easy smile, the same confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his action. In interviews about the family's philanthropic work, he spoke eloquently about the importance of healthcare access and emergency medical services, apparently without any awareness of the irony in his work. The engagement announcement included details about the couple's future plans, their shared commitment to community service, their excitement about building a life together in Portland. Reading it felt like being stabbed with a knife, made of my own naivety. This was the life Ryan had chosen instead of me, the future he had protected by erasing me from his past. My third year of medical school brought clinical rotations, the first real opportunity to work directly with patients instead of just studying about them in textbooks. My surgery rotation was scheduled for the spring, and I had specifically requested to spend it in the trauma department under Dr. Chen's supervision. By this point, she had become more than a mentor. She was the closest thing I had to a role model for the kind of surgeon I wanted to become. The trauma bay was where I felt most alive, most connected to the reason I had chosen medicine in the first place. There was something about the controlled chaos of emergency surgery, the split-second decisions that could save or lose a life, that brought out the best in my ability. The other students in my rotation were intimidated by the pressure, but I thrived on it in a way that surprised even Dr. Chen. "You have instincts for this work that can't be taught," she told me after I had assisted on a particularly complex case involving a motorcycle accident victim. The combination of technical skill and emotional resilience that trauma surgery requires isn't something everyone possesses. It was during this rotation that I had my first real experience with a case that mirrored my own accident. A young woman, about the age I had been when Ryan betrayed me, was brought in after a car crash. She was unconscious, severely injured, and like I had been, she was initially unidentified because the driver of the other vehicle claimed not to know her. Working on her case brought back memories I had tried to suppress, but it also crystallized my understanding of what I wanted to do with my medical career. I didn't just want to be a trauma surgeon, I wanted to be an advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, someone who would fight for the abandoned and forgotten in the same way that Dr. Chen had fought for me. The young woman survived, eventually made a full recovery, and the truth about her relationship with the other driver was eventually revealed. But working on her case reminded me of how close I had come to being just another statistic, another Jane Doe who died alone in a hospital because someone who should have protected her chose to protect himself instead. My fourth year of medical school was dedicated to preparing for residency applications and board exams, the final hurdles before I could begin specialized training in surgery. The application process was brutal, requiring letters of recommendation, personal statements, research presentations, and interviews at hospitals across the country, but my academic record was flawless now. My research with Dr. Chen had resulted in published papers, and my clinical performance had earned recognition from every attending physician I had worked with. When the residency match results were announced, I had achieved something that seemed impossible 6 years earlier, when I was learning to hold a pen again. I had matched into the surgical residency program at Mercy General Hospital, the same institution where Dr. Chen had saved my life. I would be training under the trauma surgery team that had given me a second chance at life, and I would be working in the same emergency department where I had learned what it meant to fight for survival. The night before I started my residency, I drove past the intersection where the accident had happened. The intersection had been redesigned since then, with better traffic signals and improved visibility, changes that had probably prevented other crashes, like the one that had nearly killed me. Standing at that corner, looking at the place where my old life had ended and my new one had begun, I felt a strange sense of gratitude mixed with determination. Ryan Mitchell had made a choice that night that he probably never thought about anymore. He had decided that protecting his reputation was more important than taking responsibility for someone he claimed to love. That choice had set in motion a series of events that had transformed me from a naive pre-med student into someone who understood the true cost of survival. But what Ryan didn't know was that his betrayal had created something he never could have anticipated. He had abandoned a vulnerable young woman, but in doing so, he had forged a surgeon who would never abandon anyone. He had protected himself from the consequences of his actions, but those consequences were still waiting for him, just taking a different form than he could have imagined. As I stood at that intersection, 6 years after the night that had changed everything, I made a promise to myself that was different from the desperate vows I had made in my hospital bed. This wasn't about revenge or justice, or making Ryan pay for what he had done to me. This was about becoming the kind of person who could stand between life and death, and choose life, every single time, regardless of who was lying on that operating table. I didn't know that in less than 2 years, Ryan Mitchell would be rushed into my emergency department, his life hanging in the balance, his fate entirely in my hands. I didn't know that the skills I was about to develop, the expertise I was about to gain, would be tested in the most personal way possible. But standing at that intersection, looking toward the hospital where I would begin my residency the next morning, I knew that everything I had survived had been leading to something bigger than my own recovery.
Ryan had left me for dead, but I was very much alive. And soon I would have the power to make the same choice about him that he had made about me all those years ago. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.